We begin, though, with this ongoing surge in COVID hospitalizations and yet another milestone on case numbers. We've surpassed 69 million, according to an NBC News tally.
Now, the very first confirmed case in this country came exactly 2 years ago this week. Now, as the pandemic rages on, hospitalizations are reaching a rate we have not seen in about a year. This week, on any given day, about 159,000 Americans were in the hospital with COVID. On Thursday, Dr. Anthony Fauci predicted most cities will hit their peaks in mid-February as officials around the country scramble for solutions. We have team coverage to help us break down and understand the latest pandemic headlines.
We begin with NBC News correspondent Cal Perry. He's in D.C. at one of many brand new clinics being called a COVID community center. Hi, Cal. Good morning. This is certainly a different type of community center than we're used to, but the point here really is that a clinic in the heart of a community. Washington's mayor announced plans to open 8 of these. So what kind of services will they provide, and what's the ultimate goal with these?
So, look, they're advertising it to D.C. as a one-stop shop for any of your COVID needs. That is, of course, vaccinations and testing. There's an option here on testing. You can come to one of these centers, get tested in the center, or you can take a test home. That should be key for D.C. residents. As you said, D.C. divided into 8 wards. 8 of these centers are going to open for this week. 4 next week. Wards 1, 2, 7, and 8 opened this week. I'm outside Ward 2. One of the other key things about this, Savannah, are the hours. As part of the community outreach, as trying to get to some of these communities that are underserved, these more typically communities of color, of course, they're keeping these centers open later. 8, 9 p.m. these centers are open. They're trying to get to people, of course, whose lives have been so badly disrupted. D.C. has seen, they think, the worst of what has been the worst of the peaks. This third peak, this Omicron peak, they do think they've sort of seen the worst of it now. We had a hospitalizations peak this week, according to the mayor. Hopefully that's going to be in the clear. But these centers are designed really as a double down effort against the next peak, Savannah.
And Cal, overall, D.C. actually has had a relatively high vaccination rate, but COVID-related deaths have increased. What are health officials saying about that rise?
You know, we heard 2 things this week. The mayor testifying in front of Congress, she said that this variant, the Omicron variant, 99% of all cases in D.C. are responsible for that variant. So it gives you an idea of how transmissible this variant was. The other thing we heard on Tuesday in a press conference, 10 people who died last week. That was the highest number since May of 2020. They're all believed to be unvaccinated. So health officials are continuing to tell us that it is the unvaccinated that are ending up in the ICU and are ending up dying from this virus at a much higher rate than those that are vaccinated, Savannah.
So, Cal, let's talk about what can be done about exactly that. I mean, nationwide, our vaccination rate has sort of stalled at this number just above 60% of people fully vaccinated. And for people who have not yet had the shot, I mean, at this point, it seems like it's going to be a tough sell. What are these clinics doing that they think may really help someone make the decision to get the shot who, to this point, has been skeptical?
In D.C., it is about getting to these communities that, again, have been underserved. It's boring. It's repetitive at this point. We're 2 years into the pandemic. But communities of color in these cities are underserved by the community. They're underserved in any number of ways, and certainly vaccinations is true as well, as is testing. So you take the 7th Ward in D.C., east of the Anacostia River. This is a place where African Americans died at a rate 5 times that of white D.C. residents when it came to the virus. It is about getting the clinics opened in those communities, and if you listen to the mayor, it's about keeping them open later, about community outreach, about getting into those places. And again, of course, 2 years into this pandemic, it's not just D.C. It is cities across America. This is D.C.'s plan, though, going forward, Savannah.
Yeah, it certainly is cities across America. Cal Perry, thank you so much. It looks cold out there. Thanks for being there for us.
Let's bring in Dr. Amish Adalja now. He's senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. So, doctor, you spent time in the Washington area. What's your reaction to these COVID clinics? When do you think they could really make an impact?
They can make an impact today. What we want are people to be able to go one place and be able to get tested, get vaccinated, take home tests to their family members. All of that makes it much more convenient for everybody. And I think that's kind of the paradigm that we'll need to do as these cities try to get through Omicron surges. And this is something that would have benefits wherever it was. That one-stop clinics really have been shown to facilitate people's access.
Now, according to the CDC, Thursday marked 2 years since the first COVID case was actually reported in the U.S. Here we are 2 years later. You could say we're technically starting year 3 here in America, and we're in another COVID surge. Where do you think things stand right now, 2 years into this fight?
It all depends upon where you live. So we are starting to see peaking of Omicron cases and flattening of hospitalizations in some of the first cities that got hit, places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, but other places have not yet had their major Omicron surge. And that's what we expect because the whole country is not on the same timeline. But overall, as a nation, I think we're in a place where we can start to see this transition to endemicity because of 62% or so of the population being fully vaccinated, monoclonal antibodies, antivirals, better testing. So it's clearly not what it was 2 years ago, even if the number of cases and things look kind of dismal right now. It's still a very different caliber pandemic, and we are getting to a point where this is going to be managed more like other respiratory viruses because we have so much immunity in the population now. It's just getting these cities through this Omicron surge and making sure their hospitals have the ability to provide care.
And before we let you go, we do have a viewer question for you. This one actually comes from our own Ali Vitale, who we'll hear from in just a moment on a very different topic. But she asked, if you just had COVID-19, like just a few weeks ago, and you are exposed again, how likely are you to contract it? How likely are you to spread it? What action should you be taking to protect yourself and others? Your thoughts?
So once someone is infected, there's about a 90-day period where it is extremely unlikely that they can be reinfected. It doesn't mean that it never happens, but it's very unlikely to happen. So that's why the CDC guidance will say if you've been infected in the last 90 days, there's no need to quarantine. This is something where you're kind of in that kind of protective bubble. And I think you can be safe in that knowledge that you're not going to be someone who gets reinfected or is able to spread it, especially if you're someone who has hybrid immunity, meaning natural immunity from infection plus vaccine-induced immunity. So I think you're okay for that 90-day period.
Dr. Amish Adalja, thanks so much for joining us on this Friday. We appreciate it. And if you have a question, you do not have to be an NBC News correspondent. We like to hear from our viewers. Let us know. They're ready to answer your questions. Our doctors are. You can email us at morningnewsnow@nbcuni.com with your questions. And you can let us know if you'd like to stay anonymous.
Now, overnight, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with his Russian counterpart as tensions grow along the Ukrainian border. This high-stakes meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, comes just 2 days after President Biden made this comment during his news conference, suggesting he believed Russia is likely to invade Ukraine.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera.
Ukraine's president responded to that comment by tweeting, quote, "There are no minor incursions, just as there are no minor casualties." NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now with the latest on this. Mike, good morning. So let's just start first with the overnight meeting, and then we'll get into some of these comments there. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russia's foreign minister, neither was very optimistic going into this meeting that any breakthroughs would come of it. Do we now have any indication of how it went?
Yes, Savannah, that meeting just wrapped up, in fact, after 90 minutes. Now, when reporters were in the room, we heard from both men. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, he repeatedly stressed that he wanted to hear concrete answers from the United States in response to the litany of Russian concerns revolving around Ukraine, especially the potential role of NATO as accepting Ukraine as a member. From the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he really stressed the unity among our allies as we're facing this and trying to deter Russia from an invasion. And in his comments, he also laid out the two very clear choices that have been put in front of Russia. Let's take a listen to him.
We are, all of us, equally committed to the path of diplomacy and dialogue to try to resolve our differences. But we're also committed, if that proves impossible, and Russia decides to pursue aggression against Ukraine, to a united, swift, and severe response.
So that's what we saw and heard when the reporters were in the room. But obviously, after 90 minutes, a lot more was going to be said. We're going to hear from the Secretary of State at a news conference later. It should be noted that there is a rhythm to these kinds of meetings. Often when we see the Secretary of State meeting with the foreign minister, it precedes some sort of communication directly between the presidents, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Biden. So that's something we'll be looking for, whether that might be a phone call that happens in the near future.
And I know we'll be hearing from you on that all day, Mike. Now let's talk about those comments. And I mean, really, the damage control that the White House is having to do regarding several comments the president made. I mean, whether it be damage or just confusion, there was a lot to unpack here. So, of course, predicting Russia will invade Ukraine. Also, this minor incursion, we've been hearing that term thrown around a lot now, but kind of making it sound like there might be some small amount of land Russia could take that would be met with less aggressive pushback from the United States. What is the president or his press secretary saying about all of this now?
As we've been seeing this crisis unfold over the last few months, the U.S., our allies, really have been at pains to stress the fact that we are a united front, that whatever Russia does involving a potential invasion, there will be those severe consequences. You just heard Secretary Blinken reiterate that. Where the president clearly got into trouble was expanding, perhaps too bluntly, about some of the internal divisions among our allies, about the sort of range of steps Russia could take and just how unified we would be behind a response. And so when the president had an opportunity for the first time yesterday to speak to the cameras, he tried to clarify those comments and stick back on message. Let's hear the president.
I've been absolutely clear with President Putin. He has no misunderstanding. If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion. There is no doubt, let there be no doubt at all, that if Putin makes this choice, Russia will pay a heavy price.
So the prevailing wisdom has been that the U.S. is much more committed to a fuller response, regardless of what Russia does, than some of our allies, especially Germany, who has a big role to play as far as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline issue. And so this is a case, as Joe Biden often says, no one doubts that I mean what I say. Sometimes, though, I say all that I mean. That's clearly the case here.
Yeah, absolutely, including, as you said, kind of exposing these fissures within potential NATO unification there. So, Mike, we just saw the Ukrainian president's response, that tweet where he said there are no minor incursions, just as there are no minor casualties. How is the White House trying to smooth things over with Ukraine, who is, of course, listening to every word the president says?
Absolutely. The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki yesterday indicated that the president has not spoken with President Zelensky just yet. You could imagine that would be a conversation that happens in the near future. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has stressed that he is in touch on a daily basis, though, with his Ukrainian counterparts to make sure that they're constantly hearing Ukraine's concerns. You can imagine, especially probably instantly after the president's news conference the other night, the phone was ringing for the National Security Advisor. These are conversations, White House officials say, that will continue over the days ahead. One big question was whether the U.S. would participate in what Zelensky has called for, a three-part meeting with the two presidents, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Biden, as well as Zelensky at the table. That's something we haven't seen yet. The U.S. has been open to that, a potential option going forward as well.
All right, Mike, Memoli, lots to talk through there and a lot to continue to watch today, which we know you'll be on. Thanks so much.
On Capitol Hill, the House panel investigating the January 6th riot is asking for testimony from Ivanka Trump, former President Trump's eldest daughter, who also served as a senior advisor. In a detailed public letter, the committee alleges that she had direct knowledge of her father's actions on the day of the insurrection and may have overheard him trying to convince then Vice President Mike Pence to try and overturn the results of the 2020 election. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent and asker of questions to doctors, Ali Vitale, joins us now. Ali, good morning. Good to have you with us. So this letter gives us a lot of insight into what the panel says it has established and what it hopes to get from Ivanka Trump. What did we learn here? And is there any chance she could see a formal subpoena to testify?
Joe, I'm really glad that you start by making that distinction, because what this letter is a request. What it's not yet is a subpoena. Of course, we know the committee has been willing to go there in situations where they need this testimony. But what they're laying out is really clear. They want Ivanka Trump to speak as her role both as the former president's daughter, but also as someone who was a senior advisor in this White House to the conversations that she saw on January 6th. We know that the committee, for example, has been interested in the potential multiple drafts of the video from the Rose Garden that former President Donald Trump ultimately sent out on January 6th. But we also know that from this letter that they have testimony from other officials in the White House who know that Ivanka Trump was privy to conversations that former President Donald Trump was having with his then Vice President Mike Pence, trying to pressure him to overturn the election results from his role as the vice president, certifying them with Congress on the day of January 6th. All of these things critical to the investigation. Ivanka Trump's lawyers, though, responding yesterday after the letter became public, saying, as the committee already knows, Ivanka Trump did not speak at the January 6th rally. as she publicly stated that day at 3:15, quote, any security breach or disrespect to our law enforcement is unacceptable. The violence must stop immediately. Please be peaceful. And that's from a spokesperson for Ivanka Trump. Of course, the letter, if you read it, is not talking about Ivanka Trump speaking at the January 6th rally, which she did not. It's about the conversations that she had behind closed doors with her father about what happened that day.
I know you'll stay on that, Allie. Let's take a turn here now and talk about voting and elections. Democrats, as we know, failed to get their two big voting rights bills passed earlier this week. Now we're hearing of a bipartisan group of senators who are working on election reform. A group like that helped us get an infrastructure deal a while back. So what do we know about this?
Yeah, look, it's entirely possible that we end up seeing some efforts in a bipartisan fashion on voting reform. But this targeted set of issues that this bipartisan group of senators is in the early phases of talking about, many on the Democratic side have said it's not enough to just do this and nothing else. They would still like to see pressure and action moving forward on the voting rights bills that they previously failed to pass earlier this week. What this bipartisan group is doing, though, is something that's actually related to January 6th. They're seeking to, among other things, reform the Electoral Count Act, which deals with how vice presidents certify the election results. People like Joe Manchin and Mitch McConnell, they have all said that this both speaks to directly what happened on January 6th and that this is clearly a flawed old act from the 1800s that deserves another look and potential reform. That's one of the key things here. Some of the other things that could end up being on the table are finding ways to prevent election officials from being harassed. We know that was another problem in 2020, especially after former President Donald Trump and his allies ratcheted up that rhetoric against election officials who weren't doing the things that they wanted them to do. So these are all early discussions, but still a sign that there could be something done on voting, even if it's not as far as Democrats wanted to go.
And Allie, staying with voting, Senator Kyrsten Sinema facing backlash for voting against that filibuster rule change, which pretty much doomed these election reform bills for Democrats. What's the latest there? And I know we're looking ahead here, but quickly on this one, what are the implications perhaps for her 2024 re-election bid?
Yeah, look, 2024 is both an eternity away and will happen in the blink of an eye. We've already seen efforts stemming from all the way earlier in the year when Kyrsten Sinema was voicing her opposition to certain parts of the Build Back Better agenda. We've already seen groups come out urging someone to primary Kyrsten Sinema. Potentially that could be someone in the House. We've heard Representative Ruben Gallego, for example, say that he might potentially consider this kind of a run. Clearly, this is all percolating for Sinema, of course, but also for Senator Joe Manchin. Again, it's both far away and also not. We'll keep an eye on this one for sure.
Yeah, and hard to primary, I think, Joe Manchin there in West Virginia. Maybe a little different story.
Yeah.
Allie, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Now we have some sad news to share with you this morning. Loaf, the larger-than-life singer and actor, has died at the age of 74.
Loaf had a legendary career spanning nearly 6 decades. His 1977 album, Bat Out of Hell, is one of the best-selling albums of all time. He sold more than 100 million albums over the course of his career. He also won a Grammy in 1993 for his hit song, one of my favorites, I'd Do Anything for Love.
Loaf also had a prominent career on the big screen. He was a star of the cult classic The Rocky Horror Picture Show, and also had prominent roles in Fight Club and Wayne's World. The singer and actor passed away last night, surrounded by family and friends, according to a statement on his official Facebook page. We'll have more on that, too, in our next hour.
Let's get a check on your morning news now. Weather?
Which means Bill Cairns joins us now on this Friday morning. Hey, Bill, good morning.
Hey, good morning. I'm trying to remember the Wayne's World scene. Now I'm going to have to go back and go Google that and find that.
I'm sure it'll be selling on Apple today.
Yeah,
so.
Really. And Fight
That's
Club.
true. Exactly. Along with all of it. Yeah, what a great career. So let's get into this winter weather. I was afraid for Friday morning for a while this week. Everything kind of trended to being less icy. Still cold, but less icy. And that's kind of been the picture. There still are some trouble spots out there, especially in areas that don't get it a lot. Extreme South Texas and areas right on the Gulf Coast from Baton Rouge all the way over to even Pensacola and Panama City have a chance of getting some wintry weather today. So 18 million people are affected. But the worst of it, if we're going to get any damage, would likely be in the Carolinas. That's going to be late tonight into early tomorrow morning. Talking about the potential for significant ice, especially near the coast. A little bit of light snow from Columbia, South Carolina to Raleigh, which, even those areas don't get about 1 to 2 inches very often. And you can even see this morning, we've had reports of a sleet around Baton Rouge. Doesn't happen. In New Orleans, it's just rain for you. It's just quite warm enough that you're only getting plain rain. As far as the icy conditions later tonight and tomorrow, just be careful. Eastern North Carolina, it could be enough ice for some scattered power outages, especially from Wilmington to Camp Lejeune into the New Bern area. And as far as snowfall goes, not a big event by snow standards, only 1 to 2 inches, maybe by Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Elizabeth City, possibility of 3 to 4. And again, those areas don't get a lot of snow. The other story, it's cold. I mean, it's just plain cold from the Midwest all the way toward the Northeast today. And this weekend, kind of quiet. Be some snow showers out there, but there's not really any significant snow or ice storms, just a little bit of light snow in the Ohio Valley. So we're kind of at the peak of our winter cold, guys. Typically, this is usually when we hit the peak, and then we start to warm it up from here, especially as we head almost into February, which isn't that far away.
Yeah. Then it'll be December again. All right.
No, don't say that. That skips the good part.
Okay, in summer. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.